My wife moved her boyfriend into our home while I was fighting for my life in the ICU. I lay there helpless, trusting the woman I loved. Then her sister, my nurse, leaned over and whispered, "Your wife thinks you won't make it." I couldn't move, but I heard every word, and I knew I had to survive. I was still hooked to a heart monitor, unable to lift my own arm off the blanket. When my sister-in-law leaned down and whispered that my husband had already walked a real estate agent through my mother's diner and picked out a closing date for the sale of it, 4 days before the surgeon had even finished closing my chest. I want to tell you this story in the order it actually happened, because for a long time afterward, people kept asking me to skip ahead to the part where everyone gets what they deserve, and I understand the impulse. But the order is what makes it make sense. So bear with me. My name is Eleanor Voss. Everybody who has ever ordered a plate of eggs from me calls me Ellie. I am 62 years old, and for 33 years, I have owned and run the Copper Kettle, a diner on the corner of Harbor and 3rd in Millhaven, Ohio. A lake town small enough that nearly everyone in it has eaten a slice of my pie at least once in their life. My mother, Dorothy Renner, built that diner out of a defunct hardware store in 1974 with money she saved waitressing at a truck stop for 11 years. She left it to me when she died, and I always understood that inheriting it wasn't really about the building. It was about carrying forward the one thing she'd built with her own 2 hands in a life that hadn't handed her very much else. I married Gary Voss 31 years ago in the Lutheran Church on Maple Street, which still stands, though the congregation is smaller now than it used to be. I was 31. He was 34, working in insurance sales at the time, and later moved into keeping the diner's books once it was clear numbers came easier to him than they ever did to me. We built a good life. Not an extravagant one. Diners don't make anybody rich, but a steady one. A house on Larkspur Lane with a garden Gary never had much interest in, and I never had much time for. 2 children. Our son, Colin, 33 now, has worked the grill at the Kettle since he was 17, and can run the whole floor blind. Our daughter, Whitney, 29, lives 2 hours south in Columbus with her husband, and a little girl who calls me Nana, and has strong opinions about pancakes. By last spring, the diner had a wait on Saturday mornings that stretched onto the sidewalk. 4 employees on payroll besides Colin and me, and enough of a reputation in the county that a food blog out of Cleveland had written us up twice. I was 62 years old. I had a husband of 31 years, 2 grown children who still called me every week, and I believed, the way you believe things you've simply never had reason to question, that Gary and I were exactly what we appeared to be. I was wrong about that. Finding it out nearly cost me my life twice. Once on the floor of my own kitchen, and once in a hospital bed I couldn't have moved out of, even if I'd wanted to. Let me back up a little further, because there's a detail from earlier that spring that didn't mean anything to me at the time, and I need you to hold on to it the way I eventually had to in February. A woman named Renee Castellan started coming around the Kettle more than any diner really needs a visitor. She said she was a real estate agent working for a firm called Lakeshore Crown Development, and that the company had spent 2 years quietly assembling lots along our stretch of the harbor for a boutique hotel and marina project. She was polished in a way most people in Millhaven simply aren't. Sharp blazers, a leather portfolio, a handshake that lasted exactly 1 second too long. She wanted to talk about our lot. I told her, the first time and every time after, that the Kettle wasn't for sale at any number. My mother had scrubbed that grill with her own 2 hands for 30 years. And I was not going to be the woman who let it get paved into a parking lot for people who'd never once tasted her pie. Gary sat in on 2 of those meetings. I remember being glad at the time that he was finally taking an interest in protecting what we'd built. I didn't understand yet that he wasn't in the room to protect it. He was in the room to figure out how to get around me. Small things slipped past me that spring, and I want to be honest that I noticed some of them and explained everyone away, because that is what you do when the alternative is unthinkable. Gary started taking phone calls in the garage with the door shut, a habit he had never once had in 31 years of marriage. He came home one Tuesday, smelling like a perfume that wasn't mine, and when I asked, he said Renee had hugged him goodbye after a meeting that ran long, and I told myself that was an odd thing for a business acquaintance to do, but not an impossible one. The diner's equipment budget, a line item I had watched like a hawk for 3 decades, started running short by amounts too small to chase down and too consistent to be nothing. $400 here, $600 there, Gary said it was inflation. Everything's inflation lately, I told myself. Something isn't right, I remember thinking. Something isn't right. I thought it twice, and then I told myself to stop being paranoid. And that, I have since come to understand, is exactly the trap. The lie doesn't have to be big to work. It only has to be smaller than the amount of trouble you're willing to go looking for. The Thursday before everything changed, I walked into the back office to grab the bank deposit and found Gary's laptop open to an email thread with a subject line that just said timeline. He closed it before I could read past the first two words of the body, and when I asked lightly what he was working on, he said, "Just kettle stuff, don't worry about it," in a tone that landed one beat too fast and 1 degree too smooth. I stood there a second, with my hand still on the deposit bag, feeling something I didn't have a name for yet. That was the last completely ordinary Thursday I would have for a long time, and I had no idea. I collapsed on a Tuesday morning in the first week of April, flipping the breakfast special at 7:20. The diner half full, and Frank Delacroix, my cook of 25 years, standing 2 feet away at the flat top. Something came down on my chest like a car had been parked on it. A pressure that climbed into my jaw and ran down my left arm in a way I didn't have words for. I remember gripping the edge of the counter. I remember Frank's voice going sharp. Ellie, sit down right now. And I remember the tile floor of my own kitchen coming up to meet me faster than I would have thought possible. Frank called 911 before I'd even finished going down. He rode in the ambulance with me, which he had no obligation to do and did anyway, holding my hand the whole 6 minutes to Lakeshore Regional and saying, "Stay with us, Ellie. Stay right here." Over and over, the way a man talks when he's trying to keep something precious from sliding off the edge of a table. I don't remember much after the ambulance bay doors. They told me afterward it was severe blockage in 2 vessels, what the cardiologist, without a shred of poetry in his voice, called widowmaker territory, and that I was in surgery just under 5 hours for a double bypass. When I came back from it, I wasn't really back. I was in the strangest country I have ever visited, somewhere between sedated and awake, where sound reaches you like it's traveling through a wall of wet wool, and you cannot answer a single bit of it. I need to tell you something about that place, because people have asked me more than once whether I really heard what I'm about to describe, or whether fear built a story for me out of scraps. I have asked myself the same thing, but I know what I know. The way you know the shape of a room in the dark, because you've lived in it long enough to stop needing the light. And what I know started on the second night, when I heard my husband's voice through that wall of wet wool. He was not talking to me. Lakeshore Regional's cardiac ICU sits on the 3rd floor, and I know that because I heard a nurse say the room number to another nurse, 314, more times than I could count before it ever meant anything to me personally. The first voice I recognized clearly was Gary's, on what I later confirmed was the evening of day 2, talking to someone in the corner of my room in the particular hush people use in hospital hallways, the kind that pretends to be considerate and is really just trying not to get caught. "I know," he said. "I know, but I can't just walk away from this right now, not with everything sitting where it is. It would look terrible if people found out how far along things actually are." A pause. Then, quieter, "Just give me a little more time. A few more days, that's all I'm asking. I want you to sit with that the way I had to sit with it, lying there with a tube down my throat and no way to ask a single question. A few more days of what? Time. For what to happen?" I turned the words over and over in the dark behind my own eyelids and got nowhere, because I didn't have a single fact yet to hang them on. Just a voice, and a feeling underneath my ribs that had nothing to do with the surgery. The next thing I remember hearing clearly was Debbie. Deborah Voss Pruitt is Gary's younger sister by 3 years. And here's a detail I need to give you because it matters for everything that comes after. Debbie is a cardiac ICU nurse, and has been for 19 years. Not at some hospital across the county, but at Lakeshore Regional, on the very same floor where they wheeled me after surgery. She wasn't officially assigned to my case. Hospital policy generally keeps staff off a direct family member's chart. But she was on shift. She was down the hall, and she made sure she was the one who came in during the quiet hours to check my lines and straighten my pillow, because that is who Debbie has always been. The kind of person who shows up in whatever gap everyone else leaves open. Day 3, night shift, is when it happened. I remember the particular color of the light, that dim blue-white hospitals use so they can pretend they're letting you rest. And I remember the monitors beep slower than it had been earlier that day. I remember Debbie's fingers on my wrist, checking my pulse the old-fashioned way, even though the machine was already doing it for her. Because Debbie has never once in her life trusted a screen over her own hands. She leaned down close enough that I could smell the hand sanitizer, and underneath it, coffee gone cold in a paper cup somewhere down the hall. And she said it low, right against my ear. Like she wasn't even sure I could hear her, but needed to say it regardless. Gary's already walking Renee Castellan across the Kettles lot, Ellie. Don't you dare let go before you've had your say. 20 words. I have counted them more times than I could tell you since, turning them over on nights I couldn't sleep the way some people turn over rosary beads. I want you to understand what it is to receive a sentence like that, when you cannot move, cannot open your eyes, cannot ask a single follow-up question. It is like being handed a locked box and told there's something terrible inside it, and you are not allowed to look, and you are not allowed to put it down. You simply have to carry it in silence for as long as it takes your body to remember how to work again. I didn't know it yet, but that whisper was the first loose thread in a rope that was about to come completely undone. There was one phone call during my hospital stay I want to tell you about separately, because it did something for me that nothing else in that whole ordeal managed to do. Whitney put her daughter on the phone on day 6, before I could really talk back yet, just so I could hear her voice. My granddaughter, 3.5 at the time, did not understand hospitals or hearts or surgery. She understood that Nana was somewhere far away, and that this was upsetting. And she handled it the way small children handle most things too big for words. She sang me the alphabet song, all the way through, twice, slightly off-key, and then asked if I could still make her pancakes when I got better. I could not speak back to her. I could not do anything except lie there with a tube down my throat and let 2 rounds of the alphabet song wash over me like the first genuinely warm thing I had felt in days. Whitney told me afterward that I'd cried silently, tears just running sideways into the pillow, and that the monitors had registered it as a small spike in heart rate that sent a nurse hurrying in to check on me, only to find a sedated woman weeping over a 3-year-old's rendition of the alphabet. I've never told anyone until right now how much that phone call carried me through the worst of that week. 20 words from Debbie told me what I needed to fight for. 2 rounds of a slightly off-key alphabet song reminded me why. Over the next 4 days, I drifted in and out, and every time I surfaced even a little, I made myself listen. Don't react. Don't move. That thought became the only thing holding me steady, more than any medication they had running into my arm. I heard Gary on the phone again, not bothering to lower his voice this time, apparently satisfied I was too far under to matter. The doctor said even if she wakes up, there could be cognitive effects. They won't know for weeks. That was not anything any physician had told him. I confirmed later, at a follow-up appointment, that no doctor had ever said any such thing to anyone. Gary was building a story before he had a single fact to build it with. I heard Colin in the hallway outside my door, his voice tight in a way I had never once heard from my son in 33 years. "Dad, why was there a surveying crew out at the Kettle yesterday?" Frank called me. Said 2 guys in vests were out there with a tripod measuring the lot line. A long silence. Then Gary, flat and fast. "It's routine, Colin. Insurance wants updated measurements after Mom's incident, in case we need to make changes to the building for accessibility. Don't read into everything. Insurance measurements. On the lot line. Nobody surveys a property's boundary to install a wheelchair ramp, and my son, God bless him, is not a foolish man. He simply didn't have enough pieces yet to say so out loud. There was one more thing that happened around then that I only pieced together in full much later, though I felt the edges of it even at the time. A stack of papers pressed onto the rolling table beside my bed, clipped together, and a pen worked between fingers that would not close around it. A voice that wasn't Debbie's, saying something about insurance forms, while she's lucid enough to sign. And then Debbie's voice, sharper than I had ever heard it, cutting clean through the fog. She hasn't had her cognitive assessment yet. Nothing gets signed at this bedside until she has. That's policy, and you know it. The pen was gone as quickly as it had appeared. I would not understand what those papers actually were for another 6 weeks, but some part of me, even sedated, understood that something had just been stopped. Day 5. I opened my eyes for real. Not the flickering half-awareness of the days before, but real, sustained waking. A nurse I didn't recognize, A young man named Marcus noticed first and called for the resident. There was noise, light, the particular controlled commotion of a hospital room when someone surfaces further than the chart predicted. They ran their checks. What year is it? Do you know where you are? Can you squeeze my hand? I answered every question correctly, and somewhere in the middle of it, Gary walked through the door. His face did something complicated, and I want to be fair, because fairness matters to me even now. There was relief on it. Real relief. I believe that completely. But underneath it, for about half a second, something else crossed his features. Something that looked less like joy and more like a man doing quick arithmetic on a deadline he'd been counting on. He hugged me. He said, "I was so scared I was going to lose you." I said, "I know. I love you." And for the first time in 31 years of marriage, I meant one of those sentences and not the other. And I'm not going to tell you which. They kept me 9 more days for recovery and cardiac rehab before releasing me. Colin drove me home. Gary had made up the guest room downstairs so I wouldn't have to manage the staircase, which on its surface looked exactly like thoughtfulness, and I thanked him for it. I want you to remember that detail, because it is going to matter a great deal later, the guest room downstairs, and exactly why he wanted me sleeping in it, instead of the bedroom we'd shared for 3 decades. I came home to Larkspur Lane on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-April, and smiled at every single person who greeted me at that door, and I had absolutely nothing but time. In 20 words, sitting in my chest like a splinter that had finally started working its way toward the surface. Stay with me, because what I found over the 6 weeks that followed made that hospital whisper look like the gentlest part of the whole story. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a person who has decided to pay very close attention without letting anyone know she's paying attention. I lived inside that quiet for 6 weeks. Cardiac rehab gave me the perfect cover, 3 mornings a week at a clinic off Route 6, plus doctor's orders to rest most afternoons. Nobody questions a heart patient who says she's tired. Nobody watches a woman closely when she's supposedly the one being watched. The first thing I noticed in week 1 was the back office at the Kettle. Gary had told Colin and told our insurance adjuster that he wanted to consolidate some storage back there to make room for a new point-of-sale terminal Renee's firm had supposedly recommended. Reasonable enough on its face, except that when I finally worked up the strength to walk down and open the office myself on a Thursday morning while Gary was at the bank, there was no new terminal anywhere in sight. There was a banker's box shoved behind the old filing cabinet, and inside it, beneath a stack of expired supplier invoices clearly meant to disguise what sat underneath them, a manila folder bearing the Lakeshore Crown Development letterhead. Inside that folder was a document titled Durable Power of Attorney, drafted by a law office in Sandusky I had never heard of, and had no reason to have ever heard of, which I understood later was exactly the point. Clipped to it was a cover letter dated the day after my surgery. I did not touch the box. I did not say a word to Gary. I walked back out to my car, sat in the driver's seat in the Kettle's own parking lot for 11 minutes without turning the key, and then I made the first real decision of my recovery. One that had nothing to do with cardiac rehab and everything to do with survival of a different kind. I called Colin that evening and asked him to meet me at the Kettle the next morning before Frank opened the grill, just the 2 of us. He showed up at 6:10 with 2 coffees from the gas station on Route 6, and a look on his face like a man bracing for bad news. "Mom," he said, sliding into the booth across from me, "you look better than you did 2 weeks ago, but you've got the face. The one you get right before you tell a supplier we're switching vendors. I need you to be honest with me," I said. "And I need you to not soften it because I already had 1 heart attack this year, and I intend for it to be my last. Who is Renee Castellan to your father, really?" Colin's jaw did something I'd seen it do exactly twice before in his life. Once when a girl he was dating in high school lied to him about where she'd been. Once when a supplier tried to shortchange us on a produce order. A very specific tightening, right along the hinge of the bone. "Where'd you hear her name?" he said, and it wasn't really a question. "Your father on the phone when he thought I couldn't hear a thing. And a survey crew on our lot line that had nothing to do with a wheelchair ramp." Colin was quiet a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. "She's been coming around since February," he finally said. "Dad said it was just business, that Lakeshore Crown wanted the lot, and he was managing the relationship so you wouldn't have to deal with the pressure. I believed that, mostly, until about 3 weeks before you got sick. I stopped by one night to grab the truck for a produce run, and his car was parked outside the Cliffside Motor Inn out on Route 12. Not the restaurant next to it, the motel. He looked at me for a long moment, and I watched my son decide to stop protecting his father's version of events and start telling me the truth instead. I told myself it didn't mean anything, Mom. I really did. What was I supposed to say? Hey, Mom, I think Dad's real estate lady checks into motels with him. That's not exactly something a son says to his mother. When did you start thinking it might be more than business? Honestly, the morning after your surgery. I came by the house to grab a change of clothes for Dad, and there was a courier envelope on the kitchen counter from a law office in Sandusky. Dad grabbed it before I could see who it was addressed to. It said it was insurance paperwork. He paused. It wasn't addressed to both of you, Mom. I saw enough of the envelope before he snatched it away. It only had his name on it. I did not say anything for a while. Frank's key turned in the front door of the diner right around then, early as always, and Colin and I both went quiet like two people caught at something, even though neither of us had done a single thing wrong. I told Colin I needed him to keep his eyes open and his mouth shut a little while longer, and that I was going to handle this the way I handle everything. Slowly, quietly, with every fact lined up before I said a single word out loud. That afternoon, I called Debbie. We hadn't spoken since the day I came home from the hospital, both of us aware, I think, that a real conversation about what she'd whispered to me would have to happen eventually, and neither of us in any hurry to have it standing in someone's kitchen doorway. She picked up on the second ring. I need to ask you something, I said, and I need you to tell me the truth, even if it hurts your brother. There was a long breath on the other end of the line. I've been waiting 3 weeks for this call, Ellie. She told me everything then. The surveyor, which she'd heard about from a friend who tends bar at the place the crew ate lunch. The papers at my bedside on day 3, which she confirmed. In full. Were not insurance forms at all, but the very same durable power of attorney I'd found in that banker's box, presented to the floor nurse, as something routine that only needed a lucid signature. And one more thing I did not yet know, which she told me the way you'd set down something breakable. Wade, her husband, a retired county sheriff's detective who did private fraud investigation work now, had run into Renee Castellan's name before, 2 years earlier, in an entirely different context, and it had not been a good one. I don't want to say more than that over the phone, Debbie told me. But Ellie, call Wade. Today, if you can. He'll tell you himself, and he'll do it better than I can secondhand. I called Susan Ferraro first, because some decisions need a lawyer attached to them before they need anything else. Susan's office sits above the hardware store on Court Street, a small practice, mostly family law and estate work, and I'd used her once before, years back, to update our wills after Whitney was born. Not our usual attorney, Gary and I had used a man named Roland Beaker for the house closing, and every piece of paperwork since, a man Gary golfed with twice a year. Susan had never met Gary, had no reason to think of him at all, which was exactly why I called her instead of anyone closer to home. Ellie, Susan said, when I sat down across from her desk, you sound like a woman about to ask a question she already knows the answer to. I need you to assume my husband has been unfaithful and is trying to move assets out from under me, I said, and I need you to help me find out exactly how far it's gone before I say one word to anyone. Susan didn't blink. She's built like that. Steady, unhurried, the kind of woman who has heard worse before her second cup of coffee. All right, she said. Let's find out. You mentioned a durable power of attorney. Do you have the actual document or a copy? I have a photograph of the cover page. I didn't dare take the original. That's enough to start with. I'm also going to want financial records, everything you can access without him knowing you're looking. Bank statements, the diner's books, anything with Lakeshore Crown Development's name on it. She paused, pen hovering over a legal pad. You mentioned your sister-in-law's husband does fraud investigation work. Give me his number. If what you're describing is even half of what it sounds like, we're going to need someone who knows how to pull a paper trail without leaving fingerprints on it. Susan asked me, early on, whether I had the original 1974 paperwork for the building, the deed, the note my mother had signed with the bank, anything that would establish a clean chain of ownership independent of anything Gary had touched. I knew exactly where it was. A fireproof lockbox in the back of my closet that I hadn't opened in almost a decade, containing, Among other things, my mother's original bill of sale, her handwritten ledger from the diner's very first year, and a single recipe card in her handwriting for the cherry pie that's still our bestseller, stained at one corner from whatever kitchen accident happened to it sometime in 1975. I sat on my closet floor for the better part of an hour that afternoon, going through that box, before I ever brought a single page of it to Susan. I read my mother's ledger from 1974, line by line. $6 for flour, $4 for coffee filters, a triumphant note in the margin the week she finally cleared enough to hire her first employee, and understood, more clearly than I had in years, exactly what I was actually protecting that summer. Not a building. Not even really a business. A woman's proof that she had once built something out of nothing and made it last, which is a kind of proof I intended to keep adding to, one generation at a time, whatever it cost me to do it. There was one particular night, about 10 days into Wade's digging, that I think of as the actual turning point more than any single document or number. Susan and Wade came to the house at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday, after Gary had gone to what he said was a poker night at Curtis's. A real one, as it happened. One of the few things that spring that turned out to be exactly what it was supposed to be. The three of us spread every piece of paper we had across my own kitchen table under the yellow overhead light my mother had picked out in 1994, and I'd never once thought to replace. Bank statements. The photograph of the Power of Attorney's cover page. A printout of the corporate filings connecting Lakeshore Crown Development to its parent holding company. Wade's handwritten timeline, dates and dollar amounts marching down a legal pad and a draftsman's careful block print. We worked until almost 1 in the morning. Coffee gone cold in 3 mismatched mugs, Wade cross-referencing bank routing numbers, while Susan built out the legal argument in the margins of her own notes. And I sat in the middle of it all, doing the thing I am apparently built to do in a crisis, which is make sure everyone else has a full cup and a clean fork, even while my own hands were shaking too hard to trust with the coffee pot for the first 20 minutes. "You don't have to serve us, Ellie," Susan said gently, around midnight, watching me refill a mug that was already 3/4 full. "You're allowed to just sit here and let this be about you for one night." I hadn't realized I was doing it until she said something. I sat down. It was, I think, the first time in 6 weeks I let 2 other people carry something without finding a way to also be useful in the room. And it felt almost as strange as anything else that spring. Stranger, in some ways, than hearing about the money. We finished that night with a plan instead of just a pile of facts, which is a different thing entirely. A plan for what to tell Colin and Whitney, and when. Plan for the mediator. A plan, unspoken until Susan finally said it out loud around 1 in the morning, for a public reckoning, rather than a quiet legal one, because, her words, some kinds of theft need witnesses to really finish healing from, Ellie. And I think you already know that about yourself. She was right. I did already know it. I just hadn't said it out loud to anyone, including myself, until she said it first. I asked Debbie once, deep into that summer, how she'd managed 6 weeks of Sunday family dinners at Gary's mother's house, passing the mashed potatoes to a brother she knew was actively trying to destroy his own wife, without ever once giving herself away. She was quiet for a long moment before she answered, turning her water glass in slow circles on the table between us. "It was the hardest thing I've done since nursing school," she finally said. "Harder than losing patience, some weeks, and I want you to understand that's not a small thing for me to say." Every time Gary made a joke at that table, every time his mother bragged about him to the neighbor, I was doing math in my head about how many more Sundays I could sit there and smile before something in me cracked and gave the whole thing away. She looked at me directly. "I almost told you outright, twice. Once at your kitchen table, the week you came home. Once at Colin's birthday. Both times I told myself it wasn't the right moment yet. That you needed to be stronger before I handed you something that heavy. I don't know anymore if that was wisdom or cowardice. Probably some of both." "It was love," I told her. "Whatever else it was underneath. When it came out of you, it came out as love. That's the only math that matters to me." She started crying then, which Debbie almost never does. Not even at the hardest moments on her own hospital floor. And I understood, watching her, that she had been carrying a version of my crisis every single day for 6 weeks, in a way that never once showed on her face at work. At family dinners, anywhere, the particular loneliness of being the only person who knows the truth and cannot yet say it, walking through a normal life with a locked box of her own. That was the beginning of the real work. And here is where I need you to stay with me, because what came out over the following 2 weeks rearranged everything I thought I understood about the 31 years I had just spent building a life with Gary Voss. If this is your first time with us, welcome to Revenge Master. Settle in, because this one only gets heavier from here. And if those 20 words Debbie whispered hit you the way they hit me, comment the number 20. I read every single one. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because you will not want to miss what Wade Pruitt found 8 days later. Wade Pruitt met me at Susan's office 3 days later. A broad, quiet man in his early 60s, with the kind of stillness that comes from 26 years of sitting across interrogation tables from people who didn't want to talk. He shook my hand and said, "Ellie, I'm sorry we're meeting like this," and something about the plainness of it made me trust him before he'd said another word. "I want to start with Renee Castellan," he said, opening a legal pad of his own, "because I want you to understand what you're dealing with before we get into the money. 2 years ago, in Ashtabula County, there was a man named Harlan Doyle, 78 years old widower, owned about 40 acres of lakefront that a resort developer wanted badly. Renee Castellan represented that developer. Over about 14 months, she became the only person Harlan Doyle really trusted with anything: his mail, his appointments, eventually his finances. By the time his son found out what was happening, Harlan had signed a listing agreement giving Renee's brokerage an 11% commission on a 40-acre sale, nearly 4 times the standard rate in that market, and a limited power of attorney over the sale proceeds specifically. The son hired a lawyer. Renee's firm settled quietly rather than let it go to a hearing. No admission of wrongdoing, case sealed. Harlan Doyle died 8 months later. His son still won't talk about it without getting angry. I sat very still. "You're telling me she's done this before?" "I'm telling you she's very good at finding people going through something. Grief, illness, a health scare, and making herself indispensable right at the moment they're least equipped to notice what's happening. I don't know yet whether Gary understands he's a repeat customer of that particular skill, or whether he thinks this was all his idea. Either way, we're going to find out exactly how far along it's gotten." That was the first afternoon. What came after, over the following 8 days, arrived in layers, each one worse than the last, the way water finds a new low point every time you think you've reached the bottom. The first layer was money, and it was smaller than what came later, which is exactly why it had gone unnoticed for so long. Wade traced $6,400 out of the kettle's business account. Over 11 weeks before my surgery, always in amounts under $1,000, always coded in Gary's ledger as equipment maintenance or vendor deposit, never matched to an actual invoice from an actual vendor, small enough that I'd felt the shortfall as a vague unease, and never once as a fact I could point to. The second layer was bigger, and it came 4 days later. Wade pulled records showing that on the 9th day of my hospital stay, while I was still in a bed on the 3rd floor of Lakeshore Regional, still 2 days from opening my eyes for real, Gary had opened an individual checking account in his name, only at a bank branch 2 towns over, one we had never used before, and transferred $58,000 out of our joint personal savings into it. 31 years in the building. That account. Most of it money I had personally set aside from the kettle's profits for exactly the kind of emergency I was currently lying in a hospital bed having. I remember sitting at Susan's conference table when Wade said that number out loud, feeling the room tilt very slightly, the way it had tilted on the kitchen floor the morning of my heart attack. Wade told me that same afternoon why he does this kind of work now, instead of enjoying the normal retirement his pension would have allowed. 26 years on the force. I put away plenty of people who hurt others with their hands, he said, tapping his pen against the legal pad. It took me until I retired to understand how many more people get hurt by a signature than by a fist, and how much harder those cases are to get anybody to take seriously. Nobody puts up crime scene tape around a bank account. He looked at me for a second. Debbie asked me to look into this before you ever called me directly, you know. Told me about the whisper the same night she gave it to you. Said she couldn't sleep until somebody besides her knew. I hadn't known that. It changed slightly, the shape of the gratitude I carried for both of them. Not two separate acts of courage, but one continuous one. A nurse who couldn't stay silent and a husband who couldn't say no to her. Working in the same direction before I even knew there was a direction to walk in. I saw Renee Castellan in person exactly once during those 6 weeks. At the grocery store on Route 6 on a Thursday afternoon. Both of us reaching for the same shelf of coffee filters at the same moment. She smiled at me, easy and warm. The smile of a woman who had no idea yet that I knew anything at all. Ellie, you look wonderful. I heard about your surgery. I'm so glad you're doing well. I want to tell you that I said something devastating in that aisle. Something that would make a satisfying scene in the telling. I didn't. I said, "Thank you, Renee. That's kind of you." In the exact same voice I use with every customer who asks how I'm feeling. And I picked out my coffee filters, and I walked to the register, and I did not let my hands shake until I was back in my car in the parking lot with the doors locked. I've thought about that aisle a great deal since, about how ordinary she seemed, how genuinely pleasant, how impossible it would have been for a stranger watching the two of us to guess which one of us was, at that exact moment, quietly assembling a legal case against the other. I think that's the detail people understand least about this kind of betrayal from the outside. It doesn't announce itself. It stands next to you in the coffee aisle, wearing a nice blazer and asking about your health, and it means every word of the question, in whatever small, compartmentalized way a person like that is capable of meaning anything at all. "There's more," Wade said, and I understood by then that there was always going to be more. The third layer wasn't about money at all. It was about me, specifically, and how I had already, unknowingly, helped him do it. 6 weeks before my surgery, Gary had come to me one evening with a folder from Curtis Whalen, our accountant of 15 years, and Gary's Thursday night poker partner, saying the Kettles LLC paperwork needed an update for tax efficiency. Something about restructuring managerial authority so that either of us could sign for the business independently in an emergency. Since I was, in his words, not getting any younger, and neither am I. I remember signing it at our kitchen table on a Tuesday, barely reading past the first page, because in 31 years of marriage, I had never once had a reason to read a legal document from my own husband as though it might be a trap. What that document actually did, Susan explained to me later, holding it up with 2 fingers like it might be contaminated, was grant Gary sole signing authority over the Kettle's operating accounts under specific conditions, including, conveniently, a period during which the other managing member was medically incapacitated. I hadn't just failed to notice the scheme. I had signed the paperwork that made it possible, smiling at my own kitchen table, 4 months before I ever knew there was anything to smile through. "He didn't need to forge anything," Susan said quietly. "You handed him the door. He just had to wait for a reason to walk through it." I want to tell you honestly that hearing that was worse, in some ways, than hearing about the affair. An affair is a betrayal of trust in the marriage. This was something else. This was being turned, without my knowledge or consent, into a tool used against my own interests. And there is a particular kind of fury that comes with realizing your own signature was the hinge on a door somebody else swung shut on you. The fourth layer was Curtis Whalen himself, and this one stung in a smaller but somehow sharper way, because Curtis had done my mother's taxes before he ever did mine. He'd been to Colin's high school graduation. When Wade called him, under the pretense of confirming routine business records, for an unrelated audit, Curtis let slip, not yet knowing what he was confirming, that Gary had asked him back in January to streamline succession authority at the Kettle in case anything ever happens to Ellie or me. And that Curtis, believing this was ordinary estate planning between 2 people who loved each other, had drawn up the paperwork without a second thought and without ever mentioning it to me directly, because Gary had asked him, gently, not to worry Ellie with the details while she's already stressed about the diner. Curtis wasn't malicious. I want to be fair about that too. He was used exactly the same way I was. A trusted person handed a story that made an ugly thing look like tenderness. There was a moment, on the 6th day of Wade's digging, when I very nearly gave the whole thing away. Gary came home early from what he said was a supplier meeting and found me at the kitchen table with 3 bank statements spread out in front of me. Statements Wade had helped me pull under my own name from an account I still had legal access to. I heard his truck in the driveway before I heard the front door, and I had maybe 11 seconds to decide what to do with my face and what to do with the papers. I slid them under a folded dish towel and had the coffee pot in my hand by the time he walked in. "What you working on?" he asked, kissing the top of my head like a man with absolutely nothing to hide. "Bills," I said. "You know how they pile up when you spend a month in a hospital bed." He laughed at that. An easy, warm laugh I had heard 10,000 times across 31 years. And I stood there smiling back at him, with my heart going harder than it had any business going 6 weeks post-bypass, thinking the whole time about a durable power of attorney sitting in a banker's box not 40 feet from where we stood. That night, lying in the guest room downstairs, the one he'd so thoughtfully set up for my recovery, I understood something with total clarity for the first time. Every kindness he had shown me since I woke up in that hospital bed had been a performance for an audience of exactly one person, himself, rehearsing the role of devoted husband in case anyone, including me, ever needed convincing. By the end of the second week, Wade had the complete financial picture assembled. $6,400 diverted from the Kettles account before my surgery, $58,000 moved from our joint savings during my hospital stay, and a pending listing agreement, unsigned, but drafted and dated, sitting in Renee Castellan's own files, which Wade had gained access to through channels he described only as a source who owes me a favor from 2019. For the sale of the Kettles lot and building to Lakeshore Crown Development for $2.1 million, of which Renee's brokerage would collect a 9% commission, nearly triple the standard rate. "Total exposure," Susan said, laying it all out on her conference table like a woman setting down a hand of cards she already knew would win. Just over $64,000 already gone, and a $2.1 million sale poised to happen the moment 2 physicians were willing to certify me incapacitated, or the moment I simply stopped paying close enough attention to stop it. "There's one more piece," Wade said, at what turned out to be our final meeting before I made my decision about how to handle it. "Renee's already told 2 people, a former colleague at her old brokerage, and, near as I can tell, her own sister, that she expects to be running a hospitality consulting practice out of the new hotel once it's built, working directly for Lakeshore Crown. She's been telling people that for about 5 weeks now." He paused. "5 weeks, Ellie. That's before you were even discharged from the hospital." I sat with that for a long moment in Susan's office, feeling something shift inside my chest that had nothing to do with the surgery. It wasn't grief anymore, not exactly. It was clarity, the kind that arrives cold and stays that way. My husband had used a piece of paper I signed in good faith to try to sell my mother's diner out from under me, the moment I was too sick to stop him, and he already had a woman lined up to run the building that would replace it. There was a deadline pressing on all of this that I haven't mentioned yet, and it's the reason I couldn't simply take my time putting every piece together at whatever pace felt comfortable. Wade found, buried in Renee Castellan's files alongside the unsigned listing agreement, a target closing date, the second Friday in July, 5 weeks out from the day he found it. Timed, Susan suspected, to land conveniently after what Gary's fabricated story about cognitive effects would have made a reasonable window for me to be declared unable to manage my own affairs. But before I'd recovered enough to start asking hard questions on my own. 5 weeks. That was the actual clock I was working against that whole time, ticking down underneath every cardiac rehab appointment and every performance of a happy marriage across the dinner table. Founders Day, once we settled on it, fell 9 days before that closing date, which meant I wasn't just choosing a meaningful venue for the reveal. I was choosing the very last moment on the calendar where a public reckoning could still functionally stop a sale from happening, rather than simply documenting one that already had. I didn't tell Colin or Whitney about the closing date until the family conversation at the kitchen table. I didn't want anyone making a decision under that kind of pressure who didn't absolutely have to, but I carried it myself. Every day, the way you carry a stone in your shoe that you've decided not to stop and remove, because stopping costs more than the discomfort of walking on it. I spent the next 10 days doing exactly what I do best, working the problem slowly and methodically, the way I balance the kettle's books at the end of a long month. Trace every line back to its source. Don't guess. Don't rush. Don't tip your hand until you know exactly where every dollar went. I kept going to cardiac rehab. I kept smiling at Gary across the dinner table. I let him fuss over my medication and remind me to take my evening walk down to the harbor and back. And every single kindness he showed me during those 10 days I now understood was rehearsal. Colin's 34th birthday fell in the middle of that stretch, and I used it, quietly, to get Whitney home from Columbus a full 3 weeks earlier than she'd otherwise have come, telling her only that I wanted the whole family together, while I was still riding the high of feeling well again. She brought her daughter. And for 4 days the house on Larkspur Lane was loud with a 4-year-old's questions about why Nana's chest had a zipper scar. I let myself enjoy every second of it, because I did not know yet exactly how the next month was going to go, and some part of me wanted one more ordinary week banked before I spent it. It was Whitney, actually, who gave me the idea for how to finally do this. Sitting on the back porch the second night of her visit, she mentioned that half the town had been asking Frank when the kettle was finally going to throw the big Founders' Day celebration we'd been talking about since before my heart attack. The kind of thing my mother used to throw every summer without fail. A Saturday afternoon with the whole town invited, free pie, a ribbon on whatever we'd fixed up that year. "You should still do it, Mom," Whitney said. "Everybody needs to see you back on your feet. It'd be good for the kettle. Good for you." I looked at my daughter for a long moment, and something settled into place with a quiet, terrible click. "Let's do it properly," I told her. "Invite everyone. The whole town, the way your grandmother used to. Make it a real celebration." I told Colin and Whitney everything, together, on a Sunday afternoon, 8 days before the party, sitting all three of us around the same kitchen table where I'd signed away my own protections without ever knowing it. I laid it out in order, the way I'm laying it out for you now. The surveyor, the whisper, the folder in the banker's box, Wade's numbers, all of it. And I watched my two children's faces do two very different things while I talked. Colin's face did almost nothing. He already had most of the pieces. He simply sat there while the last few slotted into place, jaw tight, hands flat on the table like a man bracing a boat against a dock in rough water. Whitney's face did everything at once. Shock, then anger, then something that looked almost like guilt, though she had absolutely nothing to feel guilty about. "I was 2 hours away the whole time," she said when I finished. "I could have come sooner. I should have asked more questions when you sounded tired on the phone in May, instead of just letting you tell me you were fine. You have a 4-year-old and a full-time job, Whitney. You weren't supposed to be running a parallel investigation from Columbus. Somebody should have told me sooner." "I'm telling you now," I said. "Before your father knows I know. Before anyone outside this table knows the whole shape of it. You're not finding out after, the way I was so afraid you would. You're finding out during, right alongside everyone who actually matters." Colin reached over and put his hand flat on top of his sister's, the way he used to when they were small, and she'd skin a knee on the sidewalk outside the kettle. Neither of them said anything else for a while. We sat there together at that kitchen table, the three of us, for the better part of an hour, not solving anything further, just letting the shape of what was coming settle over the room like weather finally breaking after a long stretch of pressure. That was the night I understood. Watching my 2 grown children absorb the worst thing that had happened to our family since my mother's death, that whatever else Gary had taken from me that spring, he had not managed to take the 2 people who mattered more to me than the diner, the house, or even, if I'm honest, than the 31 years I'd spent believing in him. I rehearsed what I would say at that party more than I have ever rehearsed anything in my life, including my own wedding vows. Not the exact words. I've never been able to hold exact words in my head under pressure, which is why what I actually said that evening came out a little different from anything I practiced. But the order of it, the shape, the parts I absolutely could not afford to leave out. Susan helped me once, sitting on my back porch with a legal pad between us, and gave me the only piece of advice about the speech itself that I actually used. Say the facts first, in order, before you say a single word about how you feel. Let the room arrive at the feeling on its own. If you tell them how angry you are, they'll watch your anger. If you just tell them what happened, they'll feel angry themselves. and that anger will be worth 10 times as much as yours." She was right about that, the way she was right about most things that spring. I practiced saying the numbers out loud in the shower, in the car, at the kitchen table alone at night after everyone else was asleep, until $64,000 and $2.1 million and 9% commission came out of my mouth as easily as a breakfast order, because I knew that if my voice cracked on the numbers would stop being the point, and I could not let that happen. Not that night. Not after everything it had cost so many people to get me to that spot in my own backyard with the truth finally sitting whole in my hands. In the 2 weeks between deciding to throw the party and the Saturday it actually happened, Gary changed in ways that told me everything and would have told anyone paying close enough attention. He was thrilled about the celebration in a way that struck me, at first, as simple relief. Relief, I assumed, that I felt well enough to want to party at all. It took me a few more days to understand what I was actually watching. Gary believed the party was good cover. A public celebration of the kettle, hosted by his recovering, grateful wife, was exactly the kind of image that made it easier to imagine. Later, a version of events in which he'd been a devoted husband the whole time, standing loyally beside a business that unfortunately, tragically, eventually had to be sold for reasons entirely outside anyone's control. He offered more than once to help coordinate the caterer, the tent rental, the guest list. I let him. Every single thing he touched, I now had a reason to watch. It was during this stretch that Wade turned up the piece of the puzzle I want to tell you about last, because it changed how I understood the whole shape of what had happened to me, not just the who. Lakeshore Crown Development, it turned out, was not really its own company at all. It was a subsidiary, 3 layers deep in a corporate structure Wade had to pull apart at the county recorder's office over 2 separate afternoons, of a holding company controlled by a man named Desmond Crane. I sat with that name for a moment before it meant anything to me. And then, all at once, it meant everything. Desmond Crane's father was Walton Crane, who had owned the hardware store my mother eventually converted into the kettle back in 1974. Except, that isn't quite right either. Walton Crane hadn't wanted to sell the building to her at all. He'd wanted to keep it and lease her the kitchen space at a rate that would have kept her permanently beholden to him. And when my mother scraped together enough to buy the building outright instead, going around him to the actual property owner, Walton Crane never forgave her for it. I remembered then, something I hadn't thought about in 30 years, the way my mother's jaw used to go tight and her sentences short whenever anyone mentioned the Cranes at the hardware co-op meetings, and how she never once explained why, and how I never once asked, the way children rarely ask their parents to relitigate old wars. Walton Crane died in 2009. His son Desmond had spent the better part of 2 decades building exactly the kind of development company that could finally finish what his father started. And when Lakeshore Crown identified our stretch of the harbor as the last parcel standing between them and a marina project they'd been assembling for years, I have to believe, though I cannot prove it, that someone at that company recognized the name Renner on the deed and understood exactly what kind of leverage a 40-year-old grudge might still be worth. Renee Castellan may not have known any of that history when she first walked into my diner in February. I don't think Gary ever knew it at all. But somebody at the top of that company did. And it is a strange, cold feeling to learn that the worst 6 weeks of your life were, in some small part, the final chapter of a fight your mother started before you were even born. I told Susan and Wade both, separately, that I didn't want that detail to become the centerpiece of anything. It wasn't Gary's excuse, and it wasn't going to become mine, but I kept it, folded up small, in the same place I kept everything else that spring, close enough to reach when I needed it. Founders' Day fell on the 2nd Saturday in June, warm enough that the lake breeze off the harbor felt like a mercy by 4 in the afternoon. My mother used to say a good Founders' Day needed 3 things: free pie, a full parking lot, and at least one person crying happy tears by sundown. And by the time Frank strung the last string of bulb lights across the patio, we had 2 of the 3 locked in before a single guest arrived. The morning of the party very nearly went wrong before it ever properly began. I had printed 3 copies of the county recorder documents the night before, one for me, one for Susan, in case I lost my nerve mid-speech, one as a backup in the glove compartment of my car, and left them, foolishly, on the kitchen counter overnight, rather than locking them away the way I'd done with everything else for 6 weeks. Gary came down for coffee at 7, an hour before I expected him, while I was still in the shower, and I came downstairs with my heart going harder than it had any business going to find him standing at the counter with his own coffee mug in one hand and my folder of documents sitting exactly where I'd left it, 6 inches from his elbow. He hadn't opened it. I could see that at a glance the elastic band was still wrapped tight around it, undisturbed. But 6 inches, and an ordinary Tuesday morning habit of checking his phone instead of the counter beside him, was the entire distance between the plan I had spent 6 weeks building and a version of that day I do not like to imagine. "Big day," he said, smiling at me over his mug, nodding toward the string lights visible through the kitchen window. "You nervous?" "A little," I told him, which was, for once that spring, the complete and honest truth. I picked up the folder as naturally as I could manage, tucked it into my bag, and told him I needed to run to the diner early to help Frank with setup. I did not breathe normally again until I was 3 blocks from the house. Guests started coming around too. Half the regulars who'd eaten breakfast at that counter for 20 years. The mayor, who cut a ribbon on the newly repainted sign my mother's name, still sat beneath in smaller letters under mine. Pastor Owens from the Lutheran Church, who married Gary and me 31 years ago and still remembered, unprompted, that I'd cried through my own vows. Frank Delacroix, in a clean apron for once in his life. Curtis Whalen came too, smiling, utterly unaware of what his own signature had helped to make possible, and I felt a small private ache looking at him that had nothing to do with anger. Colin arrived early to help set up chairs. Whitney flew back up from Columbus for the 2nd time in a month, her daughter in a sundress patterned with lemons, already asking every 10 minutes when the pie was coming out. And Debbie came in quiet, the way she always does, hugging her brother at the gate with a warmth I now understood was costing her more than anyone in that yard could have guessed. By 4:30, the lot behind the kettle was full, folding chairs, a rented tent, a table of pies that would be gone by 6. Gary moved through the crowd in a pressed blue shirt, shaking hands, laughing at the right moments, playing the part of a man celebrating his wife's recovery and his family's legacy so convincingly that I found myself, for one strange half-second, almost believing it myself. Renee Castellan was not invited, obviously. I had wondered whether Gary would find some excuse to bring her anyway, a last-minute site visit, a document that needed a signature, but he didn't. Maybe some part of him still understood that would have been a bridge too far. Small mercies. I walked to the center of the crowd around 5 o'clock, picked up a spoon and tapped the side of a lemonade pitcher. The yard went quiet, the way a room goes quiet, when people can feel something coming before they can name it. "Can I have everyone's attention?" For just a minute, Gary turned toward me, still smiling the smile he'd worn all afternoon. Colin set down his lemonade. Debbie went very still near the edge of the tent, hands folded in front of her, chin up, the posture of someone who had known this moment was coming, and had decided weeks ago to meet it without flinching. 33 years ago, I said. My mother handed me the keys to this building and told me the only thing that mattered was that people always knew exactly where to find good food and an honest answer. I've tried to live up to that every day since. So tonight, I'm going to give you an honest answer to a question most of you don't know to ask yet. Gary's smile held for another second or two before it started to slide, the way water leaves a tub. Slow, and then all at once at the very end. 6 weeks ago, I had a heart attack behind that counter. I went on, my voice steady. The way I talk when I'm explaining to a customer why their check is higher than they expected. While I was under sedation, unable to speak or move, someone brought a stack of papers to my hospital bed and told the floor nurse they were routine insurance forms that needed my signature while I was lucid enough to give it. They were not insurance forms. They were a durable power of attorney, drafted by a law office in Sandusky, that would have handed full control of my finances, my medical decisions, and this diner to my husband the moment 2 doctors agreed I couldn't say no. A glass set down somewhere behind me carefully, the way people set things down when they don't trust their own hands anymore. I wasn't able to stop that from happening, I said. But a nurse on that floor recognized what was actually in that stack of papers, and she stopped it herself. Because hospital policy requires a cognitive assessment before anything gets signed at a sedated patient's bedside. That nurse is standing right here tonight. Every head in that yard turned toward Debbie Voss Pruitt, who stood very still near the tent pole with her hands folded and her chin up, meeting every single one of those looks without flinching. "Ellie," Gary said, and his voice had gone thin in a way I had genuinely never heard from him in 31 years. "This isn't the place." "I'm not finished," I said, and I kept my voice level because I had promised myself, walking out to that spot, that I would not raise it once, not the whole time. In the 6 weeks since, I learned that $64,000 moved out of accounts I built with my own two hands, some of it from the diner, some of it from savings my mother would recognize as every extra hour she ever waitressed at a truck stop. Some of that money went toward a listing agreement for the sale of this building and this land to a company called Lakeshore Crown Development for $2.1 million. A commission on that sale, 9% of it, nearly triple the standard rate, was already promised to a woman named Renee Castillon, who has done this exact thing to at least one other family before ours in Ashtabula County, to a widower who died 8 months after she finished with him. I let that land. Curtis Whalen's face had gone pale in a way that told me he was only now understanding what his own signature had helped make possible. Pastor Owens looked at the ground like a man wishing very hard he'd left 20 minutes earlier. Gary's face had gone the color of the tablecloth behind him. "You don't understand what this year's been like for me," Gary said, and his voice had an edge of real desperation now, reaching for a version of the story that might still hold. "You were always at the diner, Ellie, always working. I was lonely, I'm not interested in the reasons tonight," I said, "and I want you to notice something. I never raised my voice, not once the entire time. I spent 31 years building this life so you would never have to be lonely a day in it. Whatever loneliness you felt, you didn't bring it to me. You brought it to a woman who's done this exact thing to another family before ours. And as it happens, to a man whose own father spent 40 years waiting for a chance to finish what he started when he tried to keep my mother's building out from under her the first time around." Something crossed Gary's face at that. Confusion, mostly. The look of a man realizing there's an entire dimension to what happened to him that he never once understood. I didn't explain it further. That part was mine to know, not his to use. "My lawyer filed for divorce Thursday," I said. "The financial disclosures are going to make this a simple process, because there isn't much room to argue with a paper trail this clean." Gary didn't say anything else. He stood there in his pressed blue shirt, under the same string lights Whitney had helped hang 2 days earlier, at a party thrown to celebrate a recovery he'd been quietly hoping wouldn't be complete. And 40 people watched him have absolutely nothing left to say. I want to pause here, because this is the part of the story where people expect me to describe some enormous, satisfying collapse, Gary breaking down, begging, the whole yard turning on him in one dramatic wave. That isn't quite what happened, and I think the truth is more useful than the version that would play better as a movie scene. What actually happened is that the party simply ended quietly. The mayor made an excuse about an early morning and left within 10 minutes, shaking my hand at the gate a beat longer than a handshake usually lasts. Pastor Owens told me he'd call during the week, and meant it. Frank clapped me on the shoulder on his way to lock the patio gate and said, "Proud of you, Ellie," in a voice thick enough that I understood exactly what it cost him. By 7:30, the lot behind the kettle was empty except for me, Colin Whitney, her daughter asleep against her shoulder, and Debbie standing among half-finished plates of pie under lights that suddenly looked a little foolish. 33 years, painted across a banner on the patio, that nobody was going to take down that night. Gary moved out within 8 days, into an apartment above the old bowling alley on Route 6, the kind of place a man rents when he still believes his circumstances are temporary. I later learned, through Colin, who kept a careful, respectful distance from his father, without ever fully cutting him off, something I respected him for more than I could say at the time, that Renee Castellan did not follow through on any plan to build a life with Gary once the money stopped moving, and the story became public in our small stretch of the county. She stopped returning his calls within 3 weeks. I take no particular pleasure in that, but I won't pretend I was surprised either. Wade filed a formal report with the county prosecutor's Financial Crimes Division the Tuesday after the party, laying out the diverted funds, the LLC authority Gary had obtained under false pretenses, and the attempted bedside signature during my sedation, which, under Ohio's statute covering financial exploitation of a person unable to protect their own interests, is not merely a marital dispute, it is a crime, whether or not it is ultimately charged as one. As of the writing of this, The investigation is still open. Susan tells me these things move slowly, that prosecutors weigh 100 considerations before deciding whether a case like mine is worth the resources of a trial, and that regardless of what happens on that front, the civil side, the divorce, the clawback of what was taken, was never going to depend on it. I made my peace with that a long time before the party ever happened. I wasn't chasing a courtroom. I was chasing the truth. And by the second Saturday in June, I already had it. The divorce settlement, once Susan finished laying out the financial trail for the mediator, moved faster and cleaner than either Gary or I expected. Ohio is an equitable distribution state, not a community property one, and Susan made sure the mediator understood the difference between marital assets fairly earned and marital assets fraudulently diverted before the ink on any settlement was dry. Gary received a fair portion of what we'd built together under the law. I want to be clear about that, because I never tried to leave him with nothing, only to make sure he didn't leave with what he'd stolen on top of what he was legally owed. The $64,000 he'd already moved was subtracted, dollar for dollar, from his share. The kettle, the building, the land, the LLC itself, stayed with me outright, its manufactured, restructured authority unwound by the same accountant's signature that had created it. Once Curtis Whalen understood exactly what he'd been used to do and cooperated fully without so much as a subpoena to help correct it. I did not sell the house on Larkspur Lane. I considered it for about a week. There were rooms in that house holding memories that didn't feel like mine to keep anymore. But Colin talked me out of it over a long dinner in July, arguing that a house is only haunted by what you decide to let haunt it, and that he'd rather help me repaint the bedroom than watch me run from it. We repainted it that August. It's a pale, quiet green now, a color Gary never would have chosen and never once asked me about, which is, in its own small way, exactly the point. 3 weeks after the party, I got a phone call I hadn't expected. A man named Peter Doyle, calling from Ashtabula County, said Wade Pruitt had passed along my name with my permission, and that he'd heard, roughly, what had happened to me, and wanted to know if I'd be willing to talk. Peter was Harlan Doyle's son. The widower Renee Castellan had maneuvered out of 40 acres of lakefront 2 years before she ever set foot in my diner. We talked for almost 2 hours that first call, and somewhere in the middle of it, I understood that I was talking to the only other person alive who knew exactly what it felt like to watch someone he loved get used as a door hinge by a stranger with a leather portfolio and a handshake that lasted 1 second too long. I never got the chance you got, Peter told me, near the end of that call, his voice going rough in a way he didn't try to hide. My father never woke up enough to fight back. You did. I hope you understand what that's worth. I did understand. I understand it a little more every week that passes. Peter's account, combined with the sealed settlement Wade had already dug up, gave the county prosecutor's office enough of a pattern to take the financial crimes referral more seriously than a single, isolated case might have warranted. 2 families, 2 health crises, 1 real estate agent who had built an entire method out of finding people at their most vulnerable and making herself the last trustworthy face they saw before everything fell apart. Renee's brokerage license came under a formal state review by the end of that summer. I don't know yet how it will resolve. I do know that 3 more former clients of hers, once the local paper ran a short piece on the pattern, quietly reached out to her old firm's compliance department to ask questions they hadn't thought to ask before. Lakeshore Crown Development withdrew its interest in our stretch of the harbor entirely by September, once it became clear the story wasn't going away quietly. And once, I suspect, someone in Desmond Crane's office ran the math on what a public fight over a 40-year-old grudge against a sympathetic 62-year-old heart attack survivor would do to a marina project that needed the town's goodwill more than it needed our particular half-acre. I never spoke to Desmond Crane directly, and I never intend to. Some fights aren't worth finishing in person. It is enough some days to know that his father lost, and that mine did too, on the only terms that ever really mattered. My mother's building is still standing, and it still has her name painted under mine. When the divorce settled, and I sat down with Susan to update my own estate plan, and my will for the first time since Whitney was born, the first thing I did was set up a modest trust, not enormous, but meaningful, to pay off the remainder of the mortgage on the small house Debbie and Wade had been carrying since a rough stretch after his retirement, and to cover what was left of their younger son's community college tuition outright, The boy wants to go into nursing himself, following his mother's path, and had been quietly worried all spring about how he'd finish paying for it. When I told Debbie what I'd done, I sat across from her at a booth in the Kettle itself on a slow Tuesday morning in late July and told her plainly what I'd arranged. She went very still, the way she had gone still in that hospital doorway the night she stopped a stranger from putting a pen in my hand. And then she cried in a way I don't think I had ever once seen her cry, not even at her own mother's funeral years before. "I didn't do it for anything, Ellie," she kept saying, wiping her face with a napkin from the dispenser on the table, the cheap kind that falls apart the second it gets wet. "You don't owe me a house." "I know I don't owe you a house," I told her. "That's exactly why you're getting one." She laughed at that, wet and unsteady, and reached across the table to squeeze my hand, and I squeezed back. And for a moment, neither of us said anything else, because some gratitude doesn't need any more words put around it than that. Colin, I brought in as a full partner that same summer, something I had always planned to do eventually, on some slow timeline I'd never bothered to pin down, but moved up considerably once I understood exactly how steady he had been through the whole thing. How he'd chosen the truth over his own comfort, even when it meant hard conversations with a father he still loved, despite everything. We had the sign repainted in September, the copper kettle, and underneath it, where my mother's name had sat alone under mine for 33 years, we added his, Rennervoss, 3 generations of the same family, right there for the whole town to read on their way in for breakfast. Colin cried a little at the unveiling, which he will deny to this day if you ask him, and Frank took a photograph of the two of us standing under it that now hangs behind the register, next to the one of my mother standing in that exact same spot in 1974, an apron tied twice around a waist half the size mine ever was. Whitney flew out more often after that summer than she had in the 2 years before it. Not because anything forced her to, but because, I think, some things, even good things, need a scare, like the one I had to remind everyone involved what actually matters. Her daughter, my granddaughter, calls the diner Nana's Kitchen now, and has developed at 4.5 extremely firm opinions about which booth is hers. She asked me once, not long after everything settled, why Grandpa Gary didn't come to the diner anymore, and I told her, as plainly and gently as I knew how, that Grandpa Gary made some choices that meant he needed to live somewhere else for a while, and that none of it was anything she had done or could have stopped. She thought about that for a moment with the particular seriousness only a 4-year-old can bring to a booster seat, and then asked if that meant she could have 2 pancakes instead of 1. I told her yes, and something in my chest that had been clenched tight since a Tuesday morning in April finally, quietly let go. Gary tried to call me twice that autumn, both times late at night, both times going straight to a voicemail I did not return. He sent one letter, in October, apologizing in the vague weather report way people apologize when they are sorry mostly about getting caught. I read it once, filed it in a drawer, and have not reread it since. I heard secondhand through people who still see him around town that he picked up seasonal work managing inventory at the marine supply store out past the highway. The kind of job a man takes when the life he expected to be living quietly falls out from underneath him, and he needs something to fill the hours. I don't wish him harm. I also don't think about him nearly as often as I once assumed I would. By the following spring, the kettle was doing better business than it had in years. Word travels in a town our size, and not always the way you'd expect. The story of what happened to me made its way around Millhaven in the particular hushed, respectful way real news does, in a place where everyone already knows everyone. And more than a few new faces started showing up on Saturday mornings just to see, I think, the woman who stood up in her own backyard and told the truth without ever raising her voice. Frank swears the tip jar hasn't done this well since before the pandemic. I think people were tipping generously because they wanted to be part of something going right for once, in a year that had handed most of them their own version of something going wrong. I think, if I'm honest, I owe you the parts of this that don't make for as satisfying a story, because the truest measure of what happened to me isn't only in what Gary did this spring. It's in everything I chose not to look at for 3 decades before it. Gary and I met in 1993, at a wedding neither of us had any real business being at, his college roommate marrying my second cousin, in a hall 2 towns over that smelled like carnations and cheap champagne. He was 31, funny in the particular way insurance men sometimes are, having learned to make small talk out of actuarial tables the same way I'd learned to make it out of pie orders. He asked me to dance twice. I said yes both times, and by the end of the night I remember thinking that here, finally, was a man who wasn't intimidated by the fact that I already knew exactly what I wanted out of my own life. Because my mother had raised me to want a diner more than she'd ever raised me to want a husband. And most men my age back then found that unsettling in a woman. I want to be fair to the man I married, even now, because fairness matters to me, and because the truth is more useful than a story where he was simply a villain from the very beginning. Gary was, for most of 31 years, a good father. He never missed a school play, even the years Colin only had one line in it. He drove 4 hours round trip in a snowstorm the winter. Whitney had her appendix out at college, and sat in a plastic chair in that hospital hallway until 6 in the morning without once complaining. He learned to make my mother's pie crust, badly, every year on the anniversary of her death, because he knew it was the one day I couldn't stand to be in the kitchen myself. Those things happened. I'm not going to pretend they didn't, just because of how the story ends. But there were smaller things too, if I go looking for them now, the way you go looking for a splinter you can feel but can't yet see. In 2011, a regional chain offered to buy the Kettles lot for a fraction of what Lakeshore Crown eventually offered. A much smaller sum, nothing close to $2 million, but real money for a couple our age at the time. I said no without hesitation. Gary argued for selling it, longer and harder than I remembered, until I sat with it again this spring, saying things like, "We could actually relax for once, Ellie, instead of working ourselves into the ground for your mother's memory." I told him then, the way I told Renee Castellan 13 years later, that the kettle wasn't for sale at any number, and he let it go, and I filed the disagreement away as an ordinary marital argument, the kind every long marriage has 100 of, rather than what I now understand it actually was. The first time my husband looked at the thing I loved most and calculated, quietly, what it was worth to him in a life without me holding on to it so tightly. There was another year, 2016, when Gary took a solo fishing trip to a cabin up near Sandusky. A whole week, which struck me as unusual even then, though I never said so, and came back different for about a month afterward. Quieter, distracted, apologizing for things that didn't need apologizing for. I asked him once if something had happened up there. He said no, that he just needed the quiet. I believed him, because I had no reason not to. And because believing the people you love is not a character flaw, even when it turns out later to have been the wrong call. I don't know, to this day, whether that week was connected to anything that came later. I've chosen not to go looking for an answer to that particular question because some doors, once you've already gotten everything you actually need out of a house, aren't worth opening just to see what's behind them. What I've come to understand, turning all of this over on the new dock behind the house some evenings after closing, is that a 31-year marriage builds up exactly the kind of trust that makes betrayal so easy to miss. Not because the person you married is inevitably going to use that trust against you, most people never do, but because trust, once it's old enough, stops feeling like a decision you're actively making every day and starts feeling like weather. You stop checking it the way you'd check a stranger, because checking feels, itself, like a kind of betrayal of the thing you've built. I don't regret trusting Gary for 31 years. I regret nothing about the woman I was for the 29 of those years that trust was earned. I only wish I'd trusted my own instincts, in 2011 and in 2016 and in 100 smaller moments I can't even list for you now, exactly as much as I trusted him. I want to tell you honestly that none of this healed as neatly as it might sound, told back to you all in a row like this. I started seeing a counselor in August, a woman named Dr. Patel, who works out of a converted house near the county courthouse, because Susan gently suggested it, and because I recognized, somewhere around my third sleepless night in a row that summer, that surviving a heart attack and a betrayal in the same season had left me with more to carry than I could sort through alone at my own kitchen table. I still see her every other week. I still, some nights, wake up at 2:47 in the morning, always that exact time, for reasons neither of us has quite figured out, replaying the sound of a stack of papers being set down on a rolling hospital table I couldn't see. Dr. Patel tells me that's a normal thing for a body to do after it's been made to feel powerless in a room it should have been safest in. I believe her. It doesn't make the 2:47 mornings any easier, but it helps to have a name for what's happening instead of just the fear of it. I am, admittedly, slower to trust new people in the diner's orbit than I used to be. When a new distributor rep came around that fall wanting to talk about a supply contract, I had Wade run a basic background check before I signed anything, which would have been unthinkable to me 18 months earlier, and now feels like simple good sense. Colin teases me about it sometimes, gently, and I let him, because I'd rather be the mother who checks than the mother who gets fooled twice by the same particular kind of stranger with a portfolio and a plan. But there's also this. On an ordinary Tuesday in October, 6 months almost to the day after I collapsed behind my own counter, I stood at the flat top flipping the breakfast special with Frank 2 feet away. Exactly as I had the morning, everything changed, and felt nothing but the ordinary, blessed boredom of a good morning shift. No fist closing around my ribs, no fear underneath it, just eggs, and the particular hiss of butter meeting a hot griddle, and Frank humming something off-key from the radio the way he's hummed off-key for 25 years. I stood there for a long moment before I said anything to anyone, letting the ordinariness of it land the way the whispered words in that hospital room once had. Except this time what landed was relief, instead of dread. I didn't know that morning that I'd remember it as clearly as I remember the morning I collapsed. But I do. I think I always will. The one place Gary tried, briefly, to fight back was in mediation, in early July, before he understood how thin the ground under him actually was. His new attorney, not Roland Beaker, who declined to represent him once he learned the full financial picture, and who quietly reached out to apologize to me himself for decades of unknowing golf course friendship, argued that the LLC restructuring Curtis Whalen had drawn up was legitimate estate planning, undertaken with my full knowledge and signature, and that nothing about it constituted fraud simply because it later proved convenient to Gary's timeline. It was, on its face, a reasonable enough argument, the kind that might have actually worked if it had been the only piece of paper in the room. Susan let him finish. Then she sat down, one at a time, like a woman dealing a hand of cards she'd been holding for exactly this moment. The courier envelope addressed to Gary alone, delivered the morning after my surgery, which Colin had seen with his own eyes. The visitor log showing papers brought to my bedside on day 3, labeled as insurance forms, intercepted by a nurse who would testify to exactly what those papers actually were. The listing agreement, unsigned but dated and detailed, sitting in Renee Castellan's own files, naming a commission structure that made sense only if the sale happened on a specific and urgent timeline. A timeline that lined up, disturbingly precisely, with my hospital stay. And finally, Peter Doyle's sworn willingness to testify to an identical pattern 2 years earlier, in a case that had already cost his family a great deal more than money. Any one of these on its own might be a coincidence, Susan said, in the same even unhurried voice she uses for everything. 4 of them, all pointing the same direction, in the same 6-week window, is not estate planning. It's a plan, and we both know exactly whose. Gary's attorney asked for a recess. When mediation resumed 40 minutes later, the argument about legitimate estate planning did not come up again. I sat down with Whitney alone, just the 2 of us, on the back porch the night before she flew home after the party, once her daughter had finally gone down for the night in the room that used to be Whitney's own bedroom. She'd been quieter than usual all weekend, and I assumed it was simply the weight of everything, until she said, out of nowhere, staring at the dark water past the dock lights, "I keep thinking about how close I came to not flying up early. If I hadn't come back for Colin's birthday, would you have told me any of this over the phone, or would I have just found out after, the way people find out things after?" It was a fair question, and I owed her a fair answer. "I don't know," I told her honestly. "I think I would have told you eventually. I don't know if I would have told you in time to be here for the party, and I think some part of that is my fault, not yours. I spent 31 years being the person who handled things quietly so nobody else had to carry the weight of them. I'm trying to get better at understanding that you're not a child I need to protect from my own life anymore. You're a grown woman with a daughter of your own, and you deserve to be trusted with hard things, not just handed the good news after I've already survived the bad ones." Whitney was quiet for a moment, and then she reached over and took my hand the way she used to when she was small enough to still need help crossing a parking lot. "I want you to call me," she said. "Next time. Whatever next time turns out to be. Not after. During. I told her I would try. I have tried since, and I am not always as good at it as I'd like to be. But I am better than I was, and some days that has to be enough. There is one conversation from that summer I have never told anyone the full details of, because it wasn't mine to tell. It happened between Colin and his father, alone, at the apartment above the old bowling alley, about 10 days after the party. Colin told me about it afterward, in pieces, over the following months, and I'm only going to give you what he gave me permission to share. He went to see Gary once, not to reconcile and not to accuse further, but because, in his words, I needed him to hear it from me directly, not through Mom's lawyer. He told his father that he loved him, that he would always love him, and that loving him didn't mean he was going to pretend what happened was survivable for the relationship the way it used to be. He told him that watching him try to take the kettle, not just from his mother, but from 33 years of a family's work, from a future Colin himself had been quietly building his whole adult life toward, had done something to him that an affair alone never would have. The affair was about you and Mom, Colin told him. The rest of it was about all of us. I need you to understand the difference because I don't think you do yet. Gary, according to Colin, didn't argue. He sat on a second-hand couch in an apartment that still had moving boxes stacked against one wall 3 months in, and he cried. And he said he understood, and Colin told me afterward that he believed his father meant it in the moment, the way Gary has always meant most things in the moment, without any particular staying power behind the meaning. They still talk, occasionally. Colin sees him for coffee every few months, out of a loyalty I respect more than I can easily explain. And I have never once asked him to choose between us, because I don't believe love is supposed to work as a tally sheet, even when someone you love has been careless with someone else's. Curtis Whalen did one more thing that summer that I want to tell you about, because it says more about the man than his mistake did. Once the corrected LLC paperwork was filed, and the review into Gary's use of his services was formally closed with no findings against Curtis himself, he came by the kettle on a Wednesday afternoon, sat at the counter, and told me he wasn't going to bill me for any of the corrective work, not the hours spent unwinding what he'd unknowingly helped create, and not, going forward, the kettle's annual tax filings for as long as I wanted him to keep doing them. I know it doesn't undo anything, he said, turning his coffee cup the way Colin does when he's uncomfortable, a habit I suspect Colin picked up from watching Curtis at our kitchen table for 15 years of poker nights. But I've done your books since before Colin could walk, Ellie, and I'd like the chance to keep doing them honestly, if you'll let me. I let him. Trust, I've learned this year, doesn't have to be a single unbroken thread. Sometimes it's something you're willing to rebuild in one particular narrow place, with one particular person, even while you're still sweeping up the pieces of it everywhere else. Frank Delacroix has cooked at the kettle for 25 years, longer than Colin has been alive, and until that spring, I don't think I ever fully understood how much he'd been quietly watching out for all of us the entire time. He told me a few weeks after the party, over a cigarette he still swears he's quitting, that he'd noticed Gary's behavior shift almost a full year before I did. The phone calls, the unexplained absences during what were supposed to be bank runs, a certain new carelessness in how Gary spoke about the diner, like a man already mentally living somewhere else. I almost said something to you last fall, Frank admitted, ash falling onto the back step. I talked myself out of it about 4 different times. Wasn't my place, I figured. Man's entitled to his own marriage. He looked at me sideways. I regret that now. I want you to know I regret that. You called 911 before I hit the floor, Frank, I told him. You don't owe me an apology for anything that happened after that. He didn't look entirely convinced, and I understand why. I think guilt like that doesn't fully listen to reason. It just eventually gets quieter with time, the way most things do. The town's reaction in the weeks after Founders Day surprised me more than almost anything else that spring. I expected gossip, and there was some, the way there always is in a place small enough that everyone's business eventually becomes everyone's business. What I didn't expect was the specific kindness of it. Mrs. Alberta Kinnick, 86 years old, who has ordered the same bowl of oatmeal at the same corner table every single morning for as long as I've run the counter, started leaving a $5 tip on a $2 bowl of oatmeal starting that June, every single day, without ever once mentioning why, until Frank finally asked her about it on my behalf. Because your mother would have done the same for me if the shoe was on the other foot, she told him, and because a woman ought to know when the whole room's on her side, even if nobody says it out loud. I cried in the walk-in cooler for about 4 minutes after Frank told me that, which is, I've come to learn, an entirely normal place to have a feeling too large for the dining room to see. There are a few more pieces from that stretch I want to circle back and tell you about, because I got ahead of myself telling you how it all turned out before I'd told you everything that got us there. I met a woman at cardiac rehab that spring I think about often, because she gave me something I didn't know I needed at the exact moment I needed it. Her name was Carol Anholt, 68. Recovering from her own bypass 8 weeks ahead of mine, with the particular dry humor of someone who has decided that surviving something terrible entitles her to laugh about it a little. We ended up on adjacent recumbent bikes 3 mornings a week for 6 weeks, and somewhere around week 2, without my ever having told her a single detail about Gary or Renee or the diner, she said, apropos of nothing, pedaling steadily beside me, "You've got the face of a woman who found something out in a hospital bed that she hasn't decided what to do with yet." I asked her how she could possibly know that. "Because I had the same face," she said. "Different situation. Same face. My husband didn't have a mistress. He had a gambling problem he'd hidden from me for 6 years, and I found the statements while he was in surgery down the hall from where you probably were." She kept pedaling, not looking at me, giving me the particular gift of not having to hold eye contact while she said the next part. "You'll know when you're ready to do something about it. Don't let anybody rush you, and don't rush yourself either. But don't let it just sit there pretending to be something you'll deal with later. Later has a way of turning into never, if you let it." I thought about Carol Anholt a great deal in the weeks that followed, pedaling nowhere together 3 mornings a week, 2 women with 2 entirely different betrayals and the exact same face. She wasn't at Founders Day. Her rehab schedule had shifted to a different clinic by then, and we lost touch the way people sometimes do even after they've told each other something true. But I think about her more often than the length of our friendship probably justifies. Because she is the reason I didn't let that banker's box sit in the back office gathering dust for another 6 months while I decided whether I was brave enough to open it. There was one piece of evidence I found myself, without Wade's help, about 10 days before the party, and I want to tell you about it because it was the only proof in this entire ordeal I didn't receive secondhand. Filtered through a lawyer's careful language, or a detective's professional distance. I found it with my own hands, on an old iPad we'd kept in the diner's back office for years to run our supplier ordering app. One Gary had logged his personal email into back in 2019, and apparently never bothered to log back out of. I wasn't looking for anything when I picked it up. I was trying to reorder napkins. But an email notification slid down from the top of the screen, a subject line that just said tonight. And something in me, some instinct I'm not proud of and don't regret, made me tap it open instead of swiping it away. What followed was 11 months of messages, going back to the previous August, 6 months before Renee Castellan ever officially introduced herself to me across my own counter. I am not going to repeat what any of it said. I don't believe you need the specific words to understand the shape of it, and I don't think reciting them would tell you anything true about the marriage that the numbers in the documents haven't already told you better. What I will tell you is that reading 11 months of a stranger's tenderness toward my husband, in his own words, in a voice I recognized because I'd been the one it used to be aimed at, was the single worst afternoon of that entire spring. Worse than the hospital, worse than the number 64,000, worse, even, than the moment I first heard Debbie's whisper through the fog. Money is a wound you can staunch with a settlement. This was something else. This took longer to stop bleeding. I sat in the back office of my own diner for 40 minutes with that iPad in my lap, and then I did something I am not entirely proud of, though I have made my peace with it since. I photographed the screen, message by message, 23 photographs in total, and sent them to Susan without a single word of explanation, because I did not trust my own voice to describe what I'd just read. She called me 40 minutes later and simply said, "I've got them, Ellie. You don't have to say anything else about this part. Let me carry it from here." I have never been more grateful for 4 sentences in my life. The divorce became final on a Tuesday morning in September, in a courthouse 2 counties, over that neither Gary nor I had ever set foot in before, chosen specifically. Susan said, "So neither of you runs into someone you know in the parking lot." It took 11 minutes. A judge with reading glasses perched halfway down her nose reviewed the settlement, asked each of us, separately, whether we understood and agreed to its terms. And when I said yes, my voice didn't shake even slightly, which surprised me more than almost anything else that whole year Gary said yes to. Quieter, looking somewhere over the judge's shoulder rather than at me. And then it was simply over, 31 years, concluded in less time than it takes to flip a full breakfast rush. I drove home alone afterward, the long way, past the harbor instead of the highway, and pulled over at the public boat launch for a while, just to sit and watch the water, because I didn't know yet what I was supposed to feel, and didn't want to perform any particular feeling for anyone, including myself. What I actually felt, sitting there with the windows down and the gulls making their usual racket over somebody's abandoned bait bucket, was something close to lightness. Not happiness, exactly. Not yet. But the specific relief of finally setting down something heavy I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying until the moment my arms were empty of it. Peter Doyle drove up from Ashtabula County in late September, on a Sunday when the kettle is closed, because he said he'd rather see the place with nobody watching him look at it. I met him in the empty dining room, chairs still up on the tables from Saturday night's close, and we sat in the corner booth, Whitney's old booth, back when she was small enough to still call it that, and talked for 3 hours about two people neither of us had ever met. His father and mine, 20 years and 40 acres and 200 miles apart, and the woman who had walked into both of their lives wearing the same kind of expensive blazer and carrying the same kind of leather portfolio. He brought a photograph of his father's property, the way it had looked before the sale, a modest farmhouse, a dock nearly identical to the one behind my own house, a stretch of shoreline that had been in his family for 3 generations before Rene Castellan ever set foot on it. The land is a private marina now, gated, with a name that has nothing to do with the Doyle family anywhere on it. Peter said he drives past the entrance sometimes, on his way to somewhere else, just to remind himself what it looks like from the outside, the way you'd touch a scar to remember it's actually healed, and not just numb. I keep thinking, he told me, near the end of that afternoon, that if somebody had done what you did, stood up in front of everybody and said it out loud, in time, my father might have had a chance to see it happen before he died instead of after. I'm not saying that to make you feel responsible for something that isn't yours. I'm saying it because I think what you did mattered more than you probably know yet. I didn't have an answer for that beyond thanking him, and meaning it more than the 2 words usually carry. We've stayed in touch since. He came back for Founders Day again this past June, and brought his own teenage daughter along to try the pie, which she declared, with the specific, brutal honesty only a 15-year-old can offer a stranger. Baking? Actually, really good. Not just old lady good. I've chosen to treat that as one of the finer reviews the kettle has ever received. It has been a little over a year now since I collapsed behind my own counter on a Tuesday morning in April, and I want to tell you what an ordinary Saturday looks like for me these days, because I think it says more than any summary of the divorce paperwork ever could. I wake at 5:15, same as I have for 34 years. In the pale green bedroom Colin talked me into keeping. I drive to the kettle before the sun's fully up, let myself in through the back, and start the coffee before Frank even gets there. Because some mornings I like the quiet of the empty dining room before it fills up with the particular good noise of a Saturday crowd. Colin arrives at 6, and we run the floor together now the way we always meant to eventually. His name on the sign under mine and my mother's. 3 generations doing the thing none of us ever really wanted to do differently. Whitney calls most Sundays, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to put her daughter on the phone so I can hear about whatever the most pressing kindergarten development of the week happens to be. Debbie and Wade come in for breakfast most Saturdays around 9, and I have never once let either of them pay for a meal in this building again, and I don't intend to start. I think about those 20 words more often than I probably should, whispered against my ear in a hospital room I couldn't see, by a woman risking her own family to give them to me at a moment when I couldn't so much as open my eyes to thank her. I have thanked her since, in every way I know how, and I will keep finding new ways for as long as I'm still standing behind this counter. But I think about the words themselves almost as much as I think about her. Gary's already walking Rene Castellan across the kettle's lot, Ellie. Don't you dare let go before you've had your say, because they arrived at the exact moment I had the least power I will probably ever have in my entire life. Unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do a single thing except decide, in whatever quiet corner of myself was still listening, that I was going to fight my way back to the people who'd shown up for me, and not the one who was already planning around my absence. I think back sometimes to the version of that spring where things went differently, where Gary's plan actually worked, where Debbie stayed silent out of exhaustion or fear or simple self-preservation, where I woke up from that surgery to find the decision about my own diner, my own money, my own life already made for me by 2 doctors' signatures, and a document dated the day after my chest was still healing. I don't spend long there. It isn't a useful place to visit for more than a minute or two. But I go there occasionally, on purpose, because I think it's important to remember exactly how close the other version came to being the true one, and how much of the distance between that version and this one was covered not by me, but by a nurse who decided 20 words were worth the risk of everything she had. I did wake up. I did have my say, though not in the way I expected, on a Saturday evening in June, instead of whatever version I might have imagined lying in that hospital bed. And I've come to believe, turning this whole spring and summer over the way I turn over a good pie crust, checking it from every angle before I trust it in the oven, that the truest measure of the people around you isn't how they behave when everything is going smoothly. It's what they choose to do in the rooms where they think you can't hear them at all. I'm not the same woman who signed a piece of paper at her own kitchen table without reading past the first page, trusting a man simply because she'd trusted him for 3 decades already. I don't think that woman was foolish. I think she was decent, in a world that doesn't always reward decency with the same decency in return. But I am a different woman now, one who reads every page, who keeps her own counsel a little longer before she hands anyone the keys to anything that matters, and who has learned, at 62 years old, that it is never too late to become someone a little harder to fool, and no less warm for the difference. Some evenings now, out on the dock behind a house I chose to keep rather than run from, I think about how close I came to signing a document I never would have agreed to. In a hospital bed, I might never have woken up clear-headed enough to stop it from happening. And I think about a nurse leaning close in the blue-white light of an ICU room at 3 a.m, choosing, in a moment that cost her something real, to tell a half-conscious woman the truth, instead of letting her drift back under, unwarned and unarmed. I owe her more than a mortgage payment and a nursing school tuition. I owe her the rest of whatever years I've got left, spent paying attention to the people who show up in the rooms where it would have been so much easier not to. Susan still handles the kettle's legal work, and has become, somewhere along the way, something closer to a friend than an attorney. We have dinner every couple of months, and she has never once sent me a bill for the hour we usually spend talking about anything except the law. Wade took on 2 more cases like mine over the following year, both referred by word of mouth through people who'd heard, one way or another, what he'd done for our family. He tells me he plans to keep doing this work for as long as his knees hold out, which, knowing Wade, will be considerably longer than any doctor would recommend. I don't know what happened to the durable power of attorney itself, the actual document, after the divorce settled. Susan keeps a certified copy in her files, for the record, in case the prosecutor's office ever needs it. I never asked what happened to the original, and I've never wanted to know. Some pieces of paper deserve to disappear into whatever drawer swallows things nobody wants to look at again, and I have decided that particular one has earned its rest. The kettle opens at 6 tomorrow morning, same as it always has, under 3 names painted on one sign. I'll be there before Frank, same as always, coffee going before the sun's all the way up, ready for whatever the day decides to bring through that door. I have found that I am no longer afraid of finding out.